Hello, and welcome to the talk entitled Visualizing Large Collections of Images, PixPlot as a Tool for Digital Humanists with a Case Study from Postwar Communal Memorial Books. My name is Elena Hoffenberg, and I'm a Ph.D. student in history at the University of Chicago. And this presentation was initially given as part of the FDR Library and Museums Conference in October 2021, entitled Examining American Responses to the Holocaust, Digital Possibilities. Unfortunately, the audio was not captured for the original presentation, so what I am recording today is just my talk, but this recording will be without the interactive element of my presentation and without the question and answer that took place at the very end and the discussion that followed. So I apologize for both the inconsistency with other videos on the conference website and the lack of this, what makes a conference unique and generative and really productive. But I hope that this presentation still sparks questions and interest in PixPlot and in memorial books as a repository of text and information as well as images. So a bit about me in the academic year 2019-2020, I served as a Digital Humanities Associate Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And what I am presenting in this workshop draws from my work as a fellow at the museum. I was interested in exploring how to use PixPlot, an image captioning tool that uses machine learning to identify patterns and group images within larger photograph collections, and to demonstrate how PixPlot can be used with Holocaust-related photographs that are either in pre-existing collections or, in my case, in a collection or in a set of visual resources that I collected together myself, which are images printed in post-war memorial books. So in this presentation, I will introduce you to the sources, the memorial books, introduce you to the tool, PixPlot, and then talk about the project, which is bringing together the sources, memorial books, and the tool, PixPlot. Unfortunately, this belatedly recorded presentation will not be able to recapture the Q&A or the live demo, but I hope that this initial set of information about the sources, tool, and project will spark further conversation, and you are welcome to be in touch with me about it if you're interested. So first of all, the sources, memorial books, they're often also referred to as Yizkor books or Yizkor Bicher, drawing on the Yiddish name for this genre as it emerged. So what you're seeing here is my best attempt to show the diversity and extent and just sort of volume of memorial books that were published in the early post-war years. So it's from the late 1940s through the 1970s. These are images from a set of digitized memorial books that are made accessible by Internet Archive, archive.org, as a result of collaboration between, among other institutions, the New York Public Library and the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. So I was interested in how memorial books have an uncertain, maybe even ambivalent standing in the field of Holocaust studies. In 1938, Jack Kugelmas and Jonathan Boyarin published From a Ruined Garden, where they translated selections from different memorial books. And works on a particular locality will often make use of memorial books to sort of provide illustrations or talk about the post-war memory of a particular local Jewish community. And then historians started asking not only how could Yizkor books be useful as a source, but also how to rigorously use them as historical sources. So scholars like Jeffrey Weidlinger and Natalia Alexian and Jeffrey Chandler have looked at these as a genre and tried to both show their weaknesses and the fallibility of these documents as early post-war testimony to argue for their relevance. They can tell us a lot about how survivors or earlier immigrants from a particular locality who were already in the United States or in Palestine during the Second World War played an active part in maintaining memory of the Holocaust. One of the scholars who has worked on memorial books extensively is Rosemary Horowitz, but her work focused on the social function of these texts and their translations. Many of these books were published in Yiddish, in Hebrew, some in English, some in other languages, but the vast majority of them were published in specifically Jewish languages like Yiddish and Hebrew. And then in the late 1990s, early 2000s, renewed efforts have taken place to get these texts translated into English so that they can reach a wider audience. There are several other works that have looked very closely at memorial books. One that's particularly interested in thinking of them as a genre and sort of looking at who was producing them. Mark Lee Smith, he wrote a PhD at UCLA on the role of Jewish historians of the Holocaust in early Holocaust history, draws our attention to the fact that some of the most prominent historians who were writing sort of proper works of history were also instrumental in creating or editing or contributing to certain memorial books. So historians like Philip Friedman, literary scholars and sort of memoirists like Isaiah Trunk contributed to 8 memorial books each. So they were playing an active role, not just in one or two that they were closely related to by virtue of their personal origins, but in growing this genre as a whole. Another place where these memorial books have been seized upon for the wonderful sources that they are is among genealogists, students of Jewish languages and literatures, and simply people who are looking online for resources about Eastern Europe and Jewish communities therein. There are some hesitations in using these volumes, so they contain a lot of material that's anecdotal or have personal recollections. So the historian's questions about how representative any one account is, how representative any one community is of larger trends in Jewish Eastern Europe are very apt and alive with these sources. But in this project, I was very interested in how to use digital techniques to read this corpus as a whole. There are 600 some memorial books that have been digitized and made freely accessible online. It's not possible for us as humans to do a close reading of all of them, but we can harness digital tools to allow us to read across this corpus, identify patterns, identify trends, and interrogate what it means to call a book a memorial book. So why bother with this? I argue this is an important way to expand the source base of knowledge about the Holocaust and pre-war Jewish life in Eastern Europe, as well as post-war memory of it, and also placing these collective or communal narratives with their complexity in conversation with memorial literature or post-war testimonies like those collected by the USD Shoah Foundation, where they're very individualized. It just adds complexity and adds greater texture to our understanding of the past. So where did I start with this project? I started with getting as many sources as I could. So the Yiddish Book Center and the New York Public Library have worked together to digitize memorial books and make them freely available online in a number of formats. For the most part, I was interested in them as PDFs because there they have text and images together. So one approach, however, would be to read them. For that, I was reliant on OCR, optical character recognition scans that had been conducted by the Internet Archive. And there are about 400 memorial books that were in Yiddish and Hebrew and had been processed using optical character recognition by Internet Archive, which hosts the scans, at least from the Yiddish Book Center and in some cases from the New York Public Library. So those 400 books would yield 145,768 pages, or nearly 33 million words. And that's a lot of material for rigorously interrogating what kind of language was used, what patterns we can see in the printed text. And using born digital sources have advantages, but there are also some disadvantages when using sources that are not originally digitized. And the memorial book corpus is a good example of what constraints still exist for using non-Roman alphabet, non-born digital sources for textual analysis. So here's an example of how complications come into this. What we have on the right is a scan of a page of text. It's relatively consistently printed. It's a good quality scan. We as humans, if we know Yiddish, if we know the alphabet, we could read this quite clearly. But the software, the optical character recognition software that scans this page and recognizes each character, including with a level of confidence, with notes about what type of font is used, whether it's the start of the word or an end of a word. It generates a lot of data, but it doesn't always have the sensitivity or the training to understand the letters as may be clear to us as human readers. And so the one particular software program, Abby Fine Reader, generates structured data from these scans that show up in the format that we see in the middle, where for each character, there are a number of parameters that the software provides information for. So I was curious. I explored doing textual analysis with these books, but this exercise helped me to decide against it because what we see is that they introduce a lot of errors. They don't always read the letters as we would read them. And part of that is because of just errors with scanning or low levels of confidence with scanning. Some of it has to do with the dictionaries that these software programs are comparing against to see whether a word is indeed a word. But sometimes highlighting the files where there are lots of OCR errors can lead to really interesting things. Here's an example of it. So this text itself, Chorben Częstochow, was printed in Romanized Yiddish by a displaced persons organization in 1948. The OCR program that I ran, I told it to look for Yiddish, and it had no idea what to do with it, where this book was printed in Yiddish, but with Roman characters. So reading it out loud or reading it as a human, we could recognize it as the language, but this OCR software knew to look for Yiddish or look for German. And this book confounded both sort of sets of assumptions for the software. So the presence of illustrations and inscriptions also create challenges where if illustrations include text, it may be recognized, but not always. But finding this troubling data point in the overall sample of books as text I tried to recognize led me to the main project, which I'll go on to explain. But I want to dwell for a moment here on what we can learn about these books and their social function and their materiality. So the book, the title page of the book is on the far right, the cover is on the far left, and then a intermediate page is in the middle. But we can see that this particular copy was given as a gift from the author to the president of the Immigrants Union in Montreal, where the author had immigrated in late 1948. The inscription was signed in April 1949. So this is a copy of the book that likely came with him. Benjamin Orenstein, the author, carried with him on his transatlantic migration. And then it was later donated to the Jewish Public Library in Montreal in 1952, donated by a Mrs. Eva Blitzstein in memory of her husband, Pinchas. So we see this book sort of changing hands twice, at least, in the inscriptions and prints and stamps that are in it. And all of that got me really interested in where these books have information that can't so easily be recognized by OCR. How are we to read these books, not just as text, but as objects that speak in a visual language and can provide us with a broad view of post-war visual memory? And I kept finding examples of interesting design in these pages. So this is one set of pages from a memorial book for Yosef Uv, where the designers of the book appended a number of blank pages to the martyrology, to the list of residents of the town who had passed away, whether during the First World War, there was a list of people who died in pogroms during and immediately after the First World War, mostly people who were killed in the Holocaust. But the designers of the book appended blank pages for the recipients of this copy to add in names that had been left out. And I've looked around for other scans of this book, and I haven't found any that have any handwritten names in them, but this was a particularly moving example of how these books, how the designers intended these books to be used and options for the ways that people could engage with them themselves. Maps were also fascinating. On the these are both hand-drawn maps, as I hope it's clear. On the right, we see a map where there is a real desire to represent the town as it was, and following certain cartographic conventions, trying to trace a grid showing how the river bypassed the town, but how certain streets led toward it. And then on the left, we see a map that takes a very different approach. This is from a book that didn't just tell the story of one community, but told about a cluster of communities that had similar experiences of persecution, and including a sort of centralization from smaller villages to a town as a part of the German occupation and forced deportation of Jews from there. But what we see here is at the core, a geographic representation of how the different villages related to the bigger town. But overall, it's a narrative. It tells a story, and we're both moving through place and time in this one map. So I was interested in the images. I wanted to be able to sort of look at all of them at once. And PixPlot was a tool that I identified that would enable me to do that. So now that we've met the source, let's meet the tool. So PixPlot is an open source software designed by the Yale Digital Humanities Lab to solve some pretty specific problems. So it's meant to solve problems that are faced by institutions that want to make collections accessible or discoverable, but have far too many photos to be able to do so by hand. It was initially developed as a way to make accessible about 27,000 photos from the late 19th century and early 20th century. And it would have been very difficult for one person to do all of the photos. And even if one were to train a team of researchers or taggers to tag the photos, describe them, it's difficult to ensure consistency and describe what in the photos is indeed most pertinent. And there are well-developed programs for auto-tagging, sort of, I don't know, my iPhone I just updated the software on my iPhone, and all of a sudden, if I search apple or bread, it will return photos of apples, of bread, without my necessarily having to label those photos apple or bread. But the problem with that is that introduces new complications, because it's reliant on learning from the language that we've used in the past to describe images, to describe them when we see images now. So this is an interactive explanation to demonstrate that point. Essentially, what it would show is that by polling the audience to provide a caption for a photo, we come up with very different ideas, and we're all right, but we're not all in complete agreement. So once we introduce language to describe photos, we bring in new sorts of contradictions or inconsistencies, but there's also other problems, as I'll go on to explain. So how PixPlot works, if you were to go to Yale's DH Lab's website and try out PixPlot, here's what you would see. So you would see a little bit of the story about the Mercier Kunthart collection and a set of 19th century images from Yale University's special collections. The sort of tool that undergirds this tool is an inception convolutional neural network, which is a deep learning tool often used in image and video classification. And it describes how the algorithm is structured. And it was trained on a set of images called Imagenet 2012, which was used to sort of teach the algorithm what the different types of images are, what different objects it should look out for. And then the way it's displayed is following a UMAP algorithm, or uniform manifold approximation and projection, which is essentially how to make information with many, many characteristics or dimensions, different sort of boxes we want to check and provide an answer to if we're evaluating an image. How this is an algorithm that allows them to be displayed in like on a screen by just 2 or 3 dimensions. So how we can make it visible and explorable to a human. However, as I mentioned before, when we use language to describe images, we bring in the biases of the past and apply them to the present. So I want to provide a content warning for slurs and racialized language If you would like to avoid this information, please just skip forward about 2 minutes in this talk, and you will miss a little bit of background about this problem, but I anticipate that if you are sensitive to the content warning, you know the gravity of the harm that this can introduce. So Imagenet 2012 is what the algorithm was trained on, and Imagenet was developed to give a sort of set of ready photos that have been described using language as a way for programmers to train their own tools to apply these tags to different images. So here's an example of the different ways that Jews were described in this data set. And you can see that there is presence of language that many Jews might find objectionable, or at the very least, not representative of what Jews look like, how Jews should be described in their variety in, the images that we're drawing upon, which are from pre-war Europe and early post-war sort of Jewish diaspora communities outside of Europe. So what PixPlot allows us to do is apply the tools of photo captioning software and algorithms that show commonality between photos without going that extra step to apply the language. The language will be based on past biases. The way that we've described photos in the past will just be replicated when we use those data points to train our tools in the future. But PixPlot allows us to just use the algorithm's ability to find commonalities between photos and then leads us to apply the labels that we find most apt. So here is where I want to transition, bringing together the sources, memorial books, and the tool PixPlot to describe the project. So here, this is sort of the prelude to the project. There is a lot of work that had to be done for me as a researcher to be able to very easily access around 600 scans, high quality scans of memorial books. And as I've already mentioned, the Yiddish Book Center and the New York Public Library, and in some cases, the Holocaust Museum as well, they were the institutions that did that work of identifying memorial books, describing them, scanning them, and providing the digital files and descriptive data about those files to Internet Archive, and then Internet Archive makes it accessible. The next step was to write a very simple Python script to go from a scan page image, so what we see on the left, to individual images, what we see on the right. And this takes a little bit of finesse, but it is easy to do with some knowledge of a programming language like Python, and to do so consistently over books, over hundreds of books, and then end up with a data set of several thousand images. So what went into this project? I used open source software and programming languages. So Python, I used OpenRefine, developed by Google, but since maintained independently. And then Palladio was also used to sort of explore some of this data. Different institutions and organizations are committed to making high quality curated information available to the public, especially online. So truly, this project would not be possible without the Yiddish Book Center, New York Public Library, Internet Archive, and of course, the Holocaust Museum support. There was some paid software that I used, or as I either purchased or used during a free trial period. That includes BBEdit, a software for editing code or other text files, Abby Fine Reader, which is an optical character recognition software, and the trusted Microsoft Excel. But I also did a lot of learning. One of the wonderful things about digital humanities projects is that you are constantly learning not just new tools, but better ways to use old tools. And I would like to really advocate for using Programming Historian, which has accessibly written tutorials that take you through all of the steps of various projects. And they do so in a way that is legible to someone in the humanities or social sciences, or someone who's just curious about these digital tools. So I highly recommend Programming Historian. So with that sort of intermission for what went into the project, this is what came out. This is several thousand images from the memorial books, all displayed at once. And here, we can see certain patterns, but it's not yet legible to us as humans. We can't really draw out themes or observations about what appears more commonly or what may appear less commonly. So this is where PixPlot is very helpful. So PixPlot can take all of these individual images, recognize similarities, group by similarities, and allow us as humans to provide the language to describe those groups and interrogate those patterns. So PixPlot identified several clusters or hotspots where lots of images came together. And this slide shows you the most representative images of those clusters as determined purely by the PixPlot algorithm. So the PixPlot wasn't necessarily looking for photos of gravestones or couples standing together or couples sort of sitting together in a studio or press reproductions, but there were enough photos like that they clustered together. So, just to take a stab at how we would describe some of these clusters, there are townscapes, there are portraits, there are single portraits, there are a couple portraits. There are group portraits, both in pictures of groups standing together or sitting together, but then also in the bottom center, we see a type of image that appeared quite frequently, which is a collection of individual portraits reproduced all together. There are several images of memorials and monuments, and there are also illustrations, book illustrations, artwork reproduced in the book or created specifically for the book. So in exploring the clusters that PixPlot identified, I was also really interested in what pictures are on the margins, what pictures are identified as PixPlot as being the most exceptional, the least like other images in these clusters. And what I found there was a lot of title pages of books, which opens up a new question. Sort of what is the visual language? What are the publishing conventions of this genre as it was emerging in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? Excuse me. So here we have a collection of 5 title pages from memorial books. And what I argue is that they show not just different visual styles, but different ways of relating to a Jewish printing tradition and Jewish traditions of memorialization. So on the right, we see a centuries-old history of invocating a gate when printing the title page of a Jewish book. And in the next from the right, we see a tree representing a diaspora from a specific place, which is fascinating to me. It's not necessarily a family tree, it's a geography tree. And then in the middle and to the left, we see perhaps more familiar tropes of memorialization, candles, cemetery gates, or tombstones, but their incorporation into the visual language of Jewish printing is interesting here, and also perhaps post-war book design. I was also interested in where art appeared in these books, and artworks often did show up on the margins of other clusters, so least like other images that were frequently in these books. Here we see reproductions of monuments. We also see reproductions of artwork, sculptures that were not as public, not as well known. And there are illustrations that are included, whether as pages for the start of a section or the conclusion of a chapter, or just sort of typographical elements that were included. And it's an open question to think about how the memorial books play a part in the wider circulation of these images and their relationship to post-war Holocaust memory in these decades. I doubt that these images are appearing uniquely in these memorial books, which makes these memorial books so much more interesting in the broader network of post-war publishing and Holocaust memory. So why is this program, or why is this project interesting? What did I want people to think about with it? So I undertook the project as a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and both as a visitor to the museum, as a scholar, I'm interested in how the museum communicates the totality of what was lost. And I think there are 2 models at play. One we see on the right, which is the Tower Faces, Yaffa Eliach's collection of documentation from a single town, Aishashok, in today's Lithuania. And the visitor encounters this twice. If you've been to the museum, perhaps you remember it, once at a higher level, once at a lower level. And you see these photos of everyday life, of people reading newspapers, of children sort of taking their first steps, of families sitting around a table, of young people having fun in nature together, of sports teams, of schools. It's the broadest array of Jewish life in Eastern Europe that's presented in one place in the museum and presented visually, which is important. We see faces, we see names, we see what they wore, where they stood. But one of the other ways that the museum decides to communicate totality is in these glass hallways, which connect the visitors from one part of the museum to another. And there are names of towns etched on this glass. But it's overwhelming to imagine how behind each single name there could be another Tower of Faces if we had the documentation, if the documentation all came together in one place. So in my project, I was interested in exploring this tension and trying to imagine what it would be like to look at all of the images from all of these places all at once. And that's something that PixPlot allows us to do, built on the basis of the memorial books that were published in the early post-war years and digitized by institutions in the 21st century. And so I hope this presentation leaves you with questions about both digital techniques for reading vast numbers of sources in new ways, but also the ways that these kinds of projects can help us think differently about post-war memory and especially the tension between remembering single places very deep in much detail and the full range of places that we cannot necessarily hold all of that detail together at the same time for all of them. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your patience with this aberrant conference presentation format. And I truly do invite you to be in touch if you have any thoughts or questions, or if you're interested in hearing more about any aspect of this project. Thank you so much.